Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Pause and Pivot. My name is Margarita V. I'm so happy to be here with you and with our co-host today. Hello, Archana. Hello, Colin.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Maggie. Hi, Colin. Hi, Julie.
Hi, and welcome, everyone. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. So, welcome, Julie. Thank you for joining us today in the audience. So, welcome to Pause and Pivot. This is a space for curious minds who love books and meaningful conversations. So, each week we take one powerful book and explore not just what the book says, but how it might change how we live. So, join us today in the conversation, remembering that this isn't a lecture space, it's a circle of communication. It's a place to pause and pivot towards something more conscious. So, for today, my friends, we are looking at molecules of emotion. OMG, this is by Dr. Candace Pert. This book has, again, changed my life. An amazing book from the 1997. Right off the bat, a quick question. So, what if your emotions aren't just feelings, but they're actually molecules that move through your body? Can you kind of sense kind of this idea of the neurochemicals that are coursing through your brain and your body that are helping to shape your clarity and your health and even your relationships? Candace Pert wrote that your body is your subconscious mind. So what does that mean to you? If that's true, then Candace says, then healing, leadership, and awareness become biological practices. What were some of your ideas as you're coming in today before we get to the book overview? How is this book landing for you?
I will go ahead and speak. So I found this book through the movie, as I've mentioned to you, What the Bleep Do We Know? And immediately I was intrigued by these ideas that our emotions can be tracked biochemically. I'd never ever contemplated that. But this title, this key phrase, your body is your subconscious mind, is actually a book that I'd already kind of been following the author. And so combining the two, it altered my perception of myself, of physiology at its core levels. Just everything changed for me. And like many people, when you're younger, especially, this kind of idea of judging your body, this book really just said, you better knock that off. And that was big for me, big for me.
I love it. I think it's so great. This was written in 1997, so it's got some history. There's been a lot of scientific advancements and research in psychology since then, but guess what? Science doesn't move really fast, and there's a lot of still old ideas and concepts. So I'm so glad that we're gonna, kind of look at some big ideas in this to see where we are now with the science.
Yeah, for myself, Maggie, this is the second time I actually was introduced to the book by you, my lab partner, from a couple of years ago. For me, and I didn't realize it was 1997. So that for some reason helps in understanding personally for myself, my journey, as far as integrating culturally
Hmm.
science and health, body and mind.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I was actually involved in a study in New York City, immigration health. So this was New York City's task force on immigration health, and we were looking at East Asian populations in New York City and Queens, and South Asian population. And at that time, it was all under the umbrella of alternative medicine. And I think what this book has done for me is really it's that bridge. It's that bridge, it's that integration, it's that, you know, um, a key to unlock, right? Not only our minds culturally, and to integrate. And so it's been really transformative. So thank you for sharing it again.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, we read it again. We read it last year, but it's like reading it again this year has been eye-opening again. We're always changing, we're always ready to absorb new information. So for anybody else joining us or watching the recording, you can just jot down when you think of emotion, what comes up for you when you're thinking of emotions and where are the emotions? How are they acting in your mind or in your body? So this book, it's almost 400 pages, over 300 pages. It took me about 10 hours or so to read. So it moves, it's a slow mover, but it's worth the read. And it's part memoir, part scientific revolution. That's the real gist of it, you know. Think about in the 1970s, Candace Pert, she went into the scientific community early on as a woman scientist. And she went in to do research on the opiate receptor. So we're going to go into the book a little bit when I do an overview. But basically, opening the door to understanding that emotions are carried by something called neuropeptides, things that were kind of just thought to be in the body. But then her discovery was that, wait a minute, it's not just in the brain, it's in the body. So this is a game changer. This is the seminal book that looked at the science of how we connect mind and body. So this absolutely challenged the dominant belief that the brain alone was the seat of the intelligence or emotions or these types of primary ways of being human, right? And so she said, if emotions are biochemical messengers, so biochemical messengers, then awareness becomes embodied. As Colin was just noting, right? It's in my body, these emotions, these chemicals, they're like a part of the making, of the foundation of building who I am. All right, so let's begin with a quick overview of just some highlights from the book. Again, this book is over 300 pages, chock full of scientific history, advancement in multiple fields in psychology, neuroscience, advancement of new technologies. So what we're going to do here is just kind of give a brief orientation on the amazing work done by Dr. Candace Pert, who in the early 1970s started to look at the neurobiology and all of the great research that came from there. So when we start to look at molecules of emotion, so the field of neuroscience is the scientific study of the nervous system, including the brain, spinal cord, and networks of nerves throughout the body, and combines biology, psychology, chemistry, and even computer science to understand how humans think, feel, learn, and behave. So this field, brand new, this is where she came into the field to create this new field. It aims to uncover how billions of neurons communicate, how the brain processes information, and how damage or disease affects mental functions. On the flip side, neuroscience also gives us hope. It helps us to understand human consciousness, thoughts, and the differences between healthy and unhealthy brain activity. So Candace Pert, who is Candace Pert? Candace Pert came into the field in the 70s as a very young researcher. She helped to discover what's called the opioid receptor, sort of like the little space along our body and our cells and our brain that was ready to receive these amazing messenger molecules so that we can feel good in our body. So she was a neuroscientist and pharmacologist. She published over 250 research articles. She was featured in many shows, including PBS series Healing in the Mind. She was considered a trailblazer in the mind-body medicine, going back to the 1980s. Absolutely revolutionized the questions, the perspectives, and brought the courage into the field of science for daring to ask, can we look and find emotions in the brain and in the body? So a lot of her work circles around discovering the opioid receptor. She was considered a pioneer of what's known as neuropeptide research. So the peptides in the brain, the peptides in the whole body. And because of her research and her focus on these neuropeptides, she helped to be a grounding voice in founding the emerging science field of psychoneuroimmunology. And that's a hard one to say. She basically, the discovery opened the doors to mapping what's known as cell receptors across the entire body. It's a game changer because before that, we'll show in a moment, there was an old view of how we only found that in the brain. So what she found was extraordinary, that receptors weren't confined just to the brain. They appeared also in other areas of the body, in whole systems, in fact, like the immune system, the gastrointestinal system, the cardiovascular system, and even in just throughout the whole body. So this helped again launch many different fields, including the fields of looking into the immune system for AIDS research. So she was known for many things, and she was known by some as the goddess of neuroscience. So this is who we're going to be looking at in her work today. Real briefly, again, not at all scientific. Please forgive me for any scientists watching this, but a real broad view of what the heck are neurons and how do they work and why are they so important. So neurons are the basic working units of the brain. Each neuron has three main parts. You might remember from school where you've learned kind of like that cell body, the soma, and then it has like dendrites that receive information from other neurons, and the axons where they send signals to other neurons, muscles, and glands, or that synaptic area where they jump. So neurons communicate through electrical impulses, and these are action potentials inside the neuron. And this is where her work was groundbreaking, because up until then, that was the main view of how the brain communicated with the body in sort of a hierarchical way from the brain down, right? And then she started to look at, wait, but hold on, what if other things are happening? And is it possible that because of those cell receptors that are through every single part of our body, are there other mechanisms, other ways that cells can communicate with each other? And so began the amazing search to look at what's known as chemical ligands or signals. So transmitters across these synapses, instead of just electrical impulses shooting back and forth between these beautiful dendrites and the neural axon connections, she discovered and went into the whole thing of the chemistry and how that is a parallel, complementary, expanded way in which the cells communicate to each other. So in this way, there's so many different processes and mechanisms which allow fast and efficient communication throughout the whole body, right? So she focused on these neurotransmitters. So we might have all heard about some of these neurotransmitters, right? Again, now these are chemical messengers that are now moving all over your body, right? And they are released by neurons to send signals to other cells. And each of these have a specific role in things like how we feel in our mood, in our capacity to recall or have memories, in our ability to direct movement into our thoughts, perceptions, movements of body, and behavior. So some of the common neurotransmitters include the dopamine that we talked about last time in Love 2.0 and other neurotransmitters. Peptides are the most numerous in the whole body, and that's where most of the research was. So that's why we're looking at neuropeptides. So much science, my friends. I really do hope you'll get the book to dive into it. But really, this started to look at the question of the imbalance. When we start to have imbalance in these neurotransmitters, right? They're not able to be moving around, then this can lead to things like mental health issues such as depression and anxiety or ADHD. So all of a sudden we're moving beyond just the thought and the ideas, and now we're connecting, like how do these things that are not things, like thoughts and emotions, how do they now impact those things that we think are things, like the body and our health? The concept of how feelings become our body or our biology. And again, we're talking about the most sophisticated, amazing system, which is the body. And if you look at just the brain, it itself is a highly complex organ containing, we don't know how many, 86 billion, 100 billion neurons, and then trillions of connections in those neural axon connections as they start to jump and hop, right, by chemical messengers. But then she came with her discoveries, And three of them are key. And one is that emotions are, again, biochemical events. They're just not left to that electrical way of transmitting information. They're a part of the chemistry in the body, and that they move, and that they're found in other parts of the body, all over the body. And the number two is the body and the mind are now being looked at being formed as one system. So no longer something that is separate, as the body and the mind are two separate things. And so began a field of interdisciplinary research and crossing previously very sacred divisions of work at NIH and NIMH. We were focusing on either mental health or the physical body. So it was a time of a lot of flux, a lot of changing of the guard in the way researchers were asking the questions and doing their research. And then the look at feelings and kind of having a feeling state in the body, and how when you get to a feeling state and release of those beautiful now neurochemicals being sent throughout the body, the idea and the concept that feelings travel through molecules. And what does that mean? And how does that include us as observers or direct participants in becoming aware of the feelings? Not only aware of the feelings, but as active participants in directing their flow. So all of these, her research revealed that emotions are carried by those tiny protein-like messengers called those neuropeptides that used to be thought only belonged in the brain, but through her research, these cell receptors were found throughout the body, and that some of these also moved, which was just groundbreaking. So as the molecules move through the body, just imagine these molecules moving from maybe the pituitary gland and then moving through the body. And then they're binding to those little beautiful cell receptors. If you can imagine like a little lily pad sitting on the edge of your cell, just waiting for those molecules to come by, which they can bind with. And they were only looking for those that were very specific. So we're looking and discovering through her research that the binding to these receptors became very specific, and it became sort of this dance. Your whole body is this dance. So this began to change how researchers were looking at stress and trauma and how it's held in the body, and different pathways to give us hope that we can be active participants in the healing of our body. So let's look again. A big part of her book, as she wants to share, is part of her story. So we're not just looking at history, but we're looking at her story as science, as a battlefield, and as a place of transformation. So again, she was a young woman when she entered into the field. She was a young scientist in her early 20s, and she was entering into an intensely competitive, male-dominated academic world. She faced a lot of marginalization, as so many women, female scientists did at the time, faced a lot of dismissals, getting looked over. And so much a part of science that you read in this book is about the battle over who gets the credit on which research and whose name is on these research articles and discoveries and who wins awards. And then related to that is who gets the funding. So this book also gives a great view of the world of science. As she describes it, often felt very combative and hierarchical, a true kind of battlefield behind the scenes of all the goodness that they're trying to bring into the world. Yet the science she was uncovering was about communication, connection, and integration. Right? So she shares in many ways that as the science shaped her with the way she focused and the questions she asked and how she devoted her life to it, she was then also shaped by science. Over time, her worldview shifted. She began to speak of science not as domination, hierarchical, but more from cooperation, and not as reduction, but as integration. It was amazing to watch her own experience, her own insights evolve. So she even described the heart of science as feminine, intuitive, unifying, relational. So, that raises a powerful question. How how does culture impact science? And how does science impact culture? And what might leadership look like if we embraced more integration over domination? And so, Candace, I just have so many quotes I would love to share, but she says, science is a search for truth, and the heart of science is feminine. So, just taking a moment for yourself, writing it down in your notes or putting it in a chat, how does that resonate with you? The heart of science is feminine. That is her truth that she came to at the end. And for me, that was, quite meaningful. So just let this land that her science was not just molecular, it was philosophical, focusing on her growing view of integration over domination. And then that integration shows up in biology itself with the big shift. And the big shift is this idea, again, moving away from the view and understanding of how the brain works from that hierarchical top-down approach. It was from the brain to the body, and that we were kind of not involved in it. It was mostly autonomic for the most part. So the old model, the brain controlled the body, and it was the one dominant control center. So think about our beliefs, our understandings of how we still may think of the brain in that way, and our connection, our capacity to how we can view feelings, thoughts, emotions, or even health and well-being. And the new model shifts and now began to view, instead of just energy and matter, which used to be in the old scientific paradigm, for centuries, Western science operated on that top-down model. Again, the brain thinks, the body obeys, right? But her research really challenged that. And so through the neuropeptides and the receptors, remember those chemicals going all over the body and then landing in those beautiful little lilies that are just on the outside of your cells. It's like a communication network, but not just like a key. It was more like a dance. She said that they're all giving a vibration and they're moving. And when they get close to a cell receptor that resonates with it, it's like it's information that's flowing through our body, and it's looking for the cell receptor where it can dance. And that's when they bind. And through her model, through the research, information began to move into what's called the information flow, or information molecules, and that they flowed in all directions, brain to body, body to brain, and even into the immune system, or immune system to nervous system. And emotions began to be her main focal point. She began to see that these emotions and their emotional tone of everything that we bring into our mind and body became these magical parts that are intertwined, that are molecular messengers. So she began to then see the whole body as intelligent. So a quote that she shared was, "Your body is your subconscious mind." How does that land for you? What does that mean to you? Mind in the body and body in the mind. Idea of like nodal networks. And this is where I get really excited, because her research, her scientific research, starts to go into, again, the cell receptors, where they're found, where they can be open to receive these messengers and then respond, right, with an emotion or an action. And they're found throughout the body, as we've been saying. But guess what? She found, and one of the most poetic insights in her book describes these dense nodal points, these points where there's a ton of these peptides, a ton of these neurochemicals, clusters of these neuropeptide receptors, right? And they're not just located in the brain, but in the 5 senses. This means sensation and emotion are inseparable. So the 5 senses, where do you take in information, right? It's not just energy and matter anymore, but information flow through what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're tasting, what you're smelling, what you're touching. These are all now a part of our mind-body complex, and guess what? Emotion is now distributed from those nodal points and into our whole mind body. So these aren't metaphors when we say, I feel it in my gut. They're biological realities. So when we say my heart aches or that didn't sit right, the mind is not separate from the body. The body is not separate from the mind. This becomes one communicative network, which then connects us to our outer body, what we're sensing from these nodal points at the end of our fingertips, what we see in our sight, what we take in from nature through food and air and everything else. So can you feel that? What we can perceive, we can now begin to feel and embody inside our body as it becomes a part of our body. So why this matters? The concept that emotions must flow to be healthy gives so much more focus and hope when we start to look at how our emotions connected to health. Through her research, beginning research, and her encouragement for future research to really start to look at the true connection, how health equals the information when it is moving freely. All the different ways that we can look at lifestyle so that we can continue to move all of those cells throughout all of our different bodies. And she argues that health depends on emotional flow. Okay, so when emotions are acknowledged and expressed, she says, communication within the body remains fluid. So all the channels are open. You might think of like the meridians from traditional Chinese medicine, or prana from the ancient yoga mechanisms as energy flows in and out of the body. So she says when emotions are repressed or suppressed or not allowed to be expressed, whether it's through shame or fear or trauma, that's when flow becomes disrupted. So we have blocked communication in our mind and body. She actually describes repressed emotions as endogenous toxins, so internally created toxins. But here's the hopeful part. Because thoughts and awareness influence biochemical release, we are not powerless. In fact, we are encouraged now to be a part of this, and that through awareness, we become participants. We influence the chemistry and the way that these neurochemicals, neuropeptides, and emotions influence not only our thoughts, but the health of our body and mind. So when your emotions are moving and your chemicals are flowing, you will experience freedom and joy. Just letting that sink in, maybe even having a connection of the feeling of those emotions and subtle energies and communication pathways. Remembering the last time you experienced freedom and joy. How many emotions do we have? And again, going back to the 70s, there were the initial 6 emotions by Paul Ekman: anger, disgust, fear, joy, sadness, surprise. And then in 1980, the 2 added ones by Robert Plutchik, he added anticipation and trust. Since then, as we know, if we've watched the Inside Out movie, we know that now there are hundreds of distinctions possible. But here's the kicker. You might have heard that name it to tame it is a really great practice when we want to kind of douse those emotions that carry us away, right? So we want to look at the power of being able to name that actual emotion that puts us, number one, in that state of awareness. And when we do that, we're able to then become a part of that process of directing the types of emotions we want to feel and where we want our biochemical events happening in our body. So the emotions are the connectors, linking and communicating across the body. So within us and between us, this is the conversation. This is what becomes a part of our body through our conscious and active participation. So I'll stop the slide share there and open it up to just love to get your shares on your big takeaways from the book.
And, for myself, just this reorientation, if you will, as far as, the it has always been traditionally classification, categorization, and sort of a comparative way of looking at, systems. And I think this for me has been really groundbreaking because it isn't just about, necessarily dichotomy, right? It's not necessarily about that. It's just more including nature versus, nurture. For me, it is in our nature to nurture, right? So it's for me, it's really been fascinating in terms of self-regulation, management, and applied knowledge. Really, she's again, it's a bridge. It's not just for the ivory tower. It's actually I think it's really transformative, personally. So and as you mentioned, we were talking about this earlier, that the toolkit's there. It's within us.
For me, Maggie, the one thing that in the reading of it that really affected me, because I was going through this process at the time that I was reading it of coming to grips with the powers that be in the world, in my own world. I just recently started branching out and thinking for myself. And frankly, just looking at the challenges she went through, it reminds me the axiom that science advances one funeral at a time. You have to, even though the math and everything she did, she could prove it scientifically, but you still have these thought beings who have become so, and see, this is where it gets down to is I started to realize through her work that we get addicted to these biochemical baths. When you think enough times and feel enough times, our bodies are addicted to the biochemistry that we've been subjected to from childhood. And then having all this information became so like in my face not too many years ago when during COVID, I ran a drug rehab center. And that whole idea of addiction and the opioid receptors and all that stuff all came right up in my face again. And the realization that we can self-generate. Ultimately, we can self-generate a whole new biochemistry, but boy, oh boy, does that take some effort, man.
I love that. Thank you both. Yeah, Colin, that points to like the big idea number one is that the body is the subconscious mind. It's like, what does that even mean? Well, if we're not aware of what we're doing, then whatever we're doing is actually making our body. And what you just said is like bringing awareness into this, saying that we are actually a part of, whether we're aware of it or not, through all of the ways that our thoughts and emotions build our body through our actions or what we bring into it. Let's spend a little bit of time and put ourselves into the process and be a part of this full communication. So being responsible now all of a sudden becomes a part of this dynamic of, are we responsible? Are we taking charge for those emotions? We mentioned sometimes that when we have emotions, it's like having our hand on a hot stove. And unlike the physiological response of getting burned with your hand, emotions don't have that automatic recoil. We can stay in those emotions and keep burning ourselves. But with awareness, we say, let's take our hand off the stove. And in that instance, we bring that consciousness. And that was at the forefront at the time. To say that actually that's going to now contribute to the building of the body.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is that place where I came to the moment where I realized if I get head knowledge, it does not translate until I can feel it. Until I can say a sentence and have the somatic response to the information, like a felt knowing, then you can say the craziest things that are true, but if you don't feel it, it's not true for you. And I think that's the thing that Candace really opened my mind to, is that, look, it's one thing to read information. It's one thing to listen to a podcast, but if you don't feel it, it's not known.
Yeah. And so let's move on to the idea of emotions must flow for health, you know? And the especially now as we look around, there's so many emotional things happening. And what do? We tend to either distract ourselves or numb ourselves and not allow ourselves to really be in the emotion. And so we say with love and respect to everything that everybody's going through is to understand how the mind and the body actually work, and how whether we're a conscious participant of how we're processing everything that's going on, how that's a direct communication, a direct correlation to the health and well-being of our future body state. So she says emotions must flow, right? She describes those neuropeptides as information substances. So whether we like it or not, we're being bombarded all the time by information, right? Through the five senses that she measured. Think of all the stuff we're watching, we're hearing, we're reading, we're taking in. And if we take it in and we repress, then the emotions can become internal toxins.
Yeah, and that's incredible agency, right? I mean, that's what is really great, because it is this for myself, even just in terms of, when I think of my own health, um, for me, it is all about integration. It is all about, I know how my body is, if there's something going on here, I literally will talk to different doctors, quite frankly, and say, well, this is what I'm feeling here. And I'm connecting dots because I'm like, this is what, it's that integration. And my body is, and I think it really behooves us to be, ultimately in charge of our communication within our body, and to be attuned to it. And I think that's where advocacy, agency, all of that. And so, and sometimes it means advocating for yourself in situations where you are up against allopathic, traditional medicine, and I don't mean traditional medicine, but systems of medicine, and where I think that inquiry is really key. And to then exercise that inquiry into action. And I think that's where I found this to be an incredible, again, very empowering, in terms of it's not just, it's validation. So, and so much courage on her part to do that.
Yeah, and she was normalizing, right? Emotional stuckness. We get there. We get stuck with emotions, and that's normal. But the thing of the impact it's going to have on our body and the health of our mental health, um, we can be at that choice point to say, you know what, if I just move my body a little bit, bring in some of that energy, some oxygen, or eat some healthy food, or just go and sit with a friend, these small actions will bring us into that new emotional resonance, that new emotional tone, and that will start the flow again.
And
So
that
she,
awareness, right?
and
As
that
you, and
awareness.
above all, awareness.
Mhm.
That's self-awareness, awareness. So, yeah, very key.
Yeah, so that's big idea number three, like consciousness or awareness influences chemistry.
Well, one of the things it did for me is, there are so many books, clear back to As a Man Thinketh by James Allen, that have put forward the idea that your thoughts are things, and they can create and they can do all these things. And this was the place, Candace, in my opinion, this was the place where she brought thought out of our heads, and it made the rubber meet the road. It's like, yeah, do you know why thoughts are things? Because they freaking release biochemistry in your body, and that's where the real deal happens. It changed for me. It changed everything. My father gave me the book As a Man Thinketh when I was 13 years old, and I can just remember thinking, because in it he tells you all these wonderful things that you can do with thought, and then he says absolutely nothing about how to do it. And I'm like, what? Not knowing that the whole time that I was even thinking that, I was creating a new biochemistry bath for myself of frustration and upset, you know.
I love that. Yeah, and she talks about that as thought or consciousness as intervention. So we talk about drugs as an intervention, right? To feel better, have some of those drugs that we enter a different state. But she goes, we have those endogenous opiates, those ways that we can produce
Mm-hmm.
ourselves the feel good hormones just by, like you said, like the thought. So we have our own intervention. Um, so, healing is just amazing, restoring that agency that Archana was talking about, something that we can now become a participant in, which was also very different, right? Because in the Cartesian era of medicine, in the earlier part, um, it was very different. It was like, very hierarchical with the medical field, and we were just there as recipients of care. But now, especially in the last 20 years, with the advancements in fields like lifestyle medicine and positive psychology and neuroimmunology and PNI, and now so many somatic related modalities, we all understand that the body now has to become a part of this intervention. And we're no longer just a passive recipient of care. She's putting us into the active participant. We're not even just aware of what's going on. We're actually choosing the interceptions, the thoughts, or using our different nodal points. And like we always say here, right? It's like these beautiful little essential oils that I douse myself, I anoint myself with every day. This is choosing to use a nodal point, the smell or the touch. And when these communicate, these bring those information molecules. It's not just a smell, a good smell. It's information molecules that is being taken in through the smell receptor, which is the closest receptor. There's only one sort of it's one step away from directly being perceived by the brain. All the different senses, like the sight, goes through 5 different nodal points. So smell is one of the most direct ways to go from an external information molecule, if you will, right to the brain, for our safety, first of all, but then all of the beautiful ways in which nature can help restore us to that homeostasis. So whether I'm grabbing a citrus, to enliven, to lift up, or lavender, which has linalool, which is more calming, these are the attributes of nature that we can bring into ourselves through our personal intervention. And so that's just a simple way of how we have gone leaps and bounds from being, not a part of those medical interventions. And now more and more, as it's more lifestyle based and more customized and personalized, how really important it is for us to be a part of that awareness and through our personal choices to bring in those interventions ourselves. I can keep going, you guys. So just what are some ways you guys like to intervene? What shifts your emotional states or brings in those mind-body connections?
Well, frankly, I can still remember when I was introduced to the idea of affirmations, and at first it sounded like, "What are you even talking about?" And then in the course of, so I teach at a massage therapy school, and I've been teaching this 3-day business class, trying to get right brain people to think left brain thoughts, and I can remember still in the course manual, there's this whole section on changing your mindset, and in it they talk about affirmations, and I used to present it because it was part of the course, and I can still remember I came back a year later, and one of the prior students that were my TA, and she says, "Oh my God, I used that affirmation thing, and I affirmed I'd never owned a new car, and I affirmed and I affirmed, and I put a time frame on it, and with 90 days I'd drive a brand new car off of the lot, and I did it, and it was fully paid for." And I was like, "Holy crap, I'm going to do that," and then that led into the EFT, and suddenly now you realize that and this is how I look at it now, these biochemicals, is if you have a thought that says, I really want a new car, your brain doesn't even think about it. It's like, oh, that's like, the sky is blue, blah, blah, blah. But if in a few minutes you come back and say, I really want a new car, then it's like, okay. But if you keep knocking on that door, it really gets down to, in my opinion, some of what we think of as scripture is actually biochemistry, because it says, knock and it shall be opened unto you, ask and it is given. If you just show up and just keep pounding on that door, life responds, and it all happens in that biochemistry.
Mhm. I really love that because she says if we learn how the brain, this is one of her things in the book, is she just wants people to learn how your brain works, how your body works. Because, like you said, if we learn that the brain works best by doing the small little things repeatedly, it activates what's called our RAS, right? Reticular activating system. And that means that if I want a new car, and then all of a sudden that's all I see. And then we start to orient all of our actions, all of our thoughts around that. So we learn how we work. And she described it so beautifully, you guys. Literally, I have quotes from like a million different pages, but in one of the places, she describes like she's experiencing all these body centric modalities and experiencing feeling states and the healing loops, which was just magical. And one in particular, she talked about her meditation. She was shown how to do Vipassana meditation. So she had a hypnotherapy session where the doctor had her think of which of the neuropeptides does she want to focus on. Because knowing how much she knew the body and the brain worked, she could literally locate where those neuropeptides were made. So, and he said, which are the most powerful ones? And she goes, beta peptide. Where are they made? Oh, right here. So she was focusing right in there. And so she said, okay, I'm going to count down to 10. And when I count down to 1, you're going to release all those neurochemicals, right? And so she said, as soon as she got down to 1, she felt a flush of like all of these neurochemicals being released. And so she said, what would happen if everybody learned that by locating where these beautiful molecules are made in our own body, we can turn on the production to feel good, to allow and support these communication mechanisms in the body to work. So meditation as biological practice, not just the fuzzy wuzzy, or you de-stress. Meditation as a way to direct the flow of this intelligence that's coursing through our body. That was very powerful.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's powerful. Yeah. As someone who has difficulty meditating, I've never been able to meditate. I just can't. But I found that humor works for me. So, individually with my biochemistry, that's the thing. It's been a lifelong journey to discover. I'm like, you know what? Humor is the common denominator for me. And so I go towards humor. And I know there are, laughing classes. I know Dr. Madan was part of a movement here in the United States and in India, where, it was just all about laughter, yoga, releasing. And I've talked to friends who suffer from depression and, just smiling. And so it's whatever, I think individually, I like that. I think that's really key, to tap into, really truly tap into and become attuned to what works for me. What gets every, the molecules, emotions flowing, what gets my emotions flowing. And I think that's, it's been incredible in terms of the individualization of all of this, right? And so, yeah, remarkable again in terms of just, agency and that having that all within us, like this empowering knowledge. So thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up, Archana, because she mentions that page 285, and she goes into there's an 8-part program that she outlines on lifestyles of the healthy, whole, and conscious person. And humor is one of squirrels. And she does mention that the beta endorphins found abundantly in the pituitary gland. That's what it is. Yeah. So it's just like this book is rich with ideas, but even more, the courage to ask questions and ask, I wonder what would happen if. And so the last idea is this idea around what she was focusing more and more on integration, versus compartmentalization, sorry, integration, and more of like a collaborative nature, not just in science, but in life. Because as her book, sometimes it was kind of hard to read because of all of the struggles and challenges, not just as a woman, but as part of the scientific community. It's very, very challenging. But her memoir does reveal the culture around science with competition and the battles of credit and funding and mostly male dominated. And I want to, share a quote on page 315 where she talks about the heart of science is feminine. In its essence, science has very little to do with competition, control, separation. All qualities that have come to be associated with science in its male-dominated 20th century form. The science I have come to know and love is unifying, spontaneous, intuitive, caring, a process more akin to surrender than domination. So, and she goes on to say, it's this inner voice that we scientists must come to trust. So some of her best insights in her research really came to her in some like mystical hunches, intuitive guesses. So, for all of our beautiful male scientists, love and adore what you're doing, but from this perspective of her story, it really shines a light on her unique challenges. So there are different voices that can come into this conversation. On the big view of it is that it's really a story that begins to look at the changes in the science, the qualities, the consciousness, and she lays out this idea of what would it look like if we actually went to more integration, intellect and intuition, data and embodiment. Competition is awesome, but so is collaboration. So I love these things, and you guys, I know we're all here talking about this idea of whole person leadership. What does that look like? She gives us the roadmap to actually personalize it, and emotional intelligence. What does that look like? And the power of that, not just for our thoughts, but as we broaden and become a participatory world, how can we change our systems thinking? What comes up for you guys when you think of this integrative model, collaborative model?
Wholeheartedly resonates, with my reorientation and having, gone to grad school and experienced some of those challenges in the ivory tower. And, and I look back and I see it as uh, affirmation that I knew at the time. For me, it was about applied learning. I was studying a very traditional cultural anthropology doctoral program, and it was all, for myself, it was very much about also integrating quantitative with qualitative data. And I was like, what's the point if we're not going to have, and then, and also applied learning, as I mentioned, and so for me, I see this as exactly, what my personal journey has been. So it's an affirmation, and then, going forward, I think that's where I listen to, I mean, I obviously want to make evidence-based decisions, but I equally am attuned to my intuition, and I, integrate all of those, experiential, that experiential and empirical knowledge. And I think that's really key. And then that allows for certainly flow and harmony and, homeostasis, and that balance. I'm able to maintain that. There isn't a competitiveness inside my body where there aren't competing agendas. I'm just trying to, integrate all of the information that's available in my life. And so I can lead, hopefully, in my personal choices and professional choices. So yeah,
Just
very resonates with me.
sorry, just a note. Julie just commented that for her, she believes that emotional intelligence is more valuable than EQ is more valuable than IQ. And I agree with you, Julie, 100%. I would so much prefer to be around people who valued EQ than just the IQ.
Love it. Yeah, we'll be looking at books that look at the research and the evidence behind the higher efficacy of focusing on emotional intelligence with kids, especially that it has its higher association with prediction of success if they work on emotional intelligence versus just learning, book learning. So I love that. Thank you so much. So as we begin to wrap up, honoring the beautiful pathway we have before us, looking at integration is wholeness, all the beautiful ways that she shared the ideas and molecules of emotion. We hope that, if this book landed with you guys, we hope that you'll consider getting it. We want to look at we're here to kind of really encourage more reading, but more than that, it's to come together and just like chat about how did these ideas, all of these ideas, I mean, look at all these notes. We could spend hours and hours and hours talking about it. And it's really just to like pick one idea. How did this land with you? Whether a quote really landed with you, pick an experiment, something that you want to do, and then decide, is this a book you want to buy, you want to borrow at the library, or read it on Audible, listen to it, or if it's just not for you. But our goal is to try and encourage more people to read more books, because we learned that about 40% of Americans haven't read one book in all of last year. So if we can move the needle on that, we'd love to engage more people to come together and share ideas, exchange perspectives, and get inspired to see, what if we take just one idea and put it into our practice in our life? What's the best it can do? Now we know it might even change our emotion, which is going to release those neurochemicals. It's going to make us feel good. And eventually it'll become our body as we make our body through those thoughts, emotions, and actions. So, Urchina, Colin, I'd love to invite you to just share a final thought, takeaway as we wrap up.
I just wanted to thank you, Maggie, for reintroducing this book. It's, again, transformative on so many levels, personally, professionally, intellectually. Looking forward to going back into it, specifically in terms of, looking at it as a roadmap. I think that's really, for me, there are a few books, and I think Colin mentioned as well that this was, the one for him. So I think I really need to reacquaint myself with material and use it as a roadmap. Especially when someone has gone in so deep and has gone in, with level and personally, so yeah, looking forward to reading it again. So thank you.
As you know, I lean towards some of the esoteric ways, and I'm a big fan of a early writer around the early 1900s, 1910, right in there, Thomas Troward. And he talks a lot about creation through self-contemplation, which is thought creation. He was one of the main voices in New Thought. But then another guy came along by the name of Neville Goddard, and I'm not sure if you're aware of Neville Goddard, but he was somebody who came along, and I ended up combining two phrases they both used, and this is what I came up with, and it says, Howard says, creation through self-contemplation. He taught this whole thing, creation through self-contemplation, but Goddard said requires that manifestation, that sensation precedes manifestation. So creation through self-concentration requires that sensation precede manifestation. And Candace Pert proved that the sensation has to happen first before it can ever manifest in your life. And then that goes back even further, where this guy I heard about said, whatsoever thing you ask, believing you already have it, it's yours.
Thank you, Colin, for that. Always bringing in those, dropping those gems.
Well, so sorry, one last thing, because this book that Neville wrote says feeling is believing.
Mhm.
So when you translate that to whatsoever thing you ask in faith, believing, what it's saying is you have to feel it. And Neville wrote a book, and I almost memorized it 10 years ago. Feeling is believing. And that's when I started really trying to be more careful with my feelings, because it denotes what I'm really believing, which is what Candace said. That's your subconscious mind.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet now.
No, don't be quiet. We love you talking. And she talks about that,
That's incredible. Please, yeah.
like body psychotherapy. She talks about that. She says that she talked about the idea of healing feeling. So, if you go to ancient traditions, they talk about get into the um, feeling state. So, not just having a temporary feeling, but having that emotional state of calm, peace, joy, whatever. We're actually being that direct participant. So, I love that sensation. So, connecting with the feeling, being able to identify, right? So, emotional fluency, literally knowing how to identify that emotion and then to manufacture it through that
How does
contemplation.
empathy play in all of this? So what if you're over feeling? What if you feel everything too
Mm,
much?
Yeah, right.
that's an interesting part.
That's the
We could have a
really
whole nother hour on that
Whole
one.
other hour. I told you. There
I
is
think
Oh,
that's where for me, like, that's the challenge.
mm,
How
mm.
do you not feel sometimes? That's right, Julie. It's really, I don't want to feel this because my body is taking it all in.
Yeah, yeah.
And then that's where, I mean, I know we'll get to emotional intelligence. It's really hard for me because I think for relationships or interactions, I feel before I feel, therefore I am. And it's too much sometimes.
Just so you know, our Urchina, my wife walked by right when you said that, and she was like, "Hell yeah!"
hell yeah. So she has so much to share, you guys. I told you this was impossible to summarize, but um, the self-image. So the idea of what do we do with all these emotions? Well, the question is, what happens if we don't do something with them? If we're just allow everything to come in and indiscriminately ignore them, distract us. So many people are numbing, distracting, repressing, and we are going to suffer, right? By the subconscious body. So if we're not connected to and choosing to be a part of this process, then we develop more of this, the subconscious, the disconnected body, if you will. What are the lifestyle practices that will allow you to be present, to name those emotions and feelings? And this is where we're at right now. How many people can sit in the discomfort of all of the onslaught of what's happening on TV, in the world, in the economy, in our schools, in our humanity? It's easy to not want to process it, but now we know that it's going to be imprinted in our body. We're gonna, especially the stress and the trauma. She goes into it and says we have to understand that as more and more of us are experiencing trauma and repeat negative feelings or unhelpful feelings, if we don't process them, they get stuck in these neuro synapses in the cells. And so we cannot just rely on talk therapy. She greatly suggests that we need to get into the body. We need to go away from the thought of just relying on talk therapy and know that our soma, our cells, hold onto those patterns, those constricted patterns of those emotions. So back to you, Archana. We can go on and on, but to say, be aware of all of the thoughts that are out there that are coming our way, and to have the courage to sit with these emotions, not say like we're a passive recipient and we're victims, but to be aware, to have the courage, to have the practices to process them through, like we said, the five senses, right? How can we breathe in something that will bring us calm, that will bring in the linalool of lavender, which it will talk to the body and say, calm, ground, you know. Through these mechanisms, we can process emotions and then choose to stand in that choice of how do we want to feel? Where do we want to focus where we have choice, where we have capacity? And then we want to bias towards action. Take that action that is in alignment with our values and where we are aiming to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something where, you know, for those of us who are maybe in terms of maybe more empathetic, I think it's important to be more mindful, right, in terms of self-regulation and awareness. So, yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everybody for joining Pause and Pivot in this amazing book, Molecules of Emotion. We don't read books just to collect information. We read them to change how we live. So this week, notice, where does emotion live in your body? Can you name it? Can you let it move? And remember, we're simply here to pause, not to stop, but to pivot. One small shift, one aligned action, one step towards feeling fully alive. So join us next time. We want to encourage you to join us next time for next week. Our book will be Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams by Matthew Walker. How does it relate to love as our focus in February? Find out and join. All right. We'll talk to you guys later next week. Thanks, everybody.